Came across this article referenced on Twitter yesterday. Why are atheists so passionate against God's existence? Uh, so I read the article, I followed the link and read the article written by Hugh Ross back in December of 2021. And I think this is worth debriefing and talking about. Hugh Ross's article and his position, and certainly the title, really conveys this idea that atheists really are a bad faith position. Atheism is a bad faith position, and it's concealing an underlying anti-theism. So that people who profess not to believe in God's existence really do, in some sense, believe in God, but they are just opposed to God. They refuse to submit to Him, which turns atheism from being an intellectual position to being a fundamentally moral position or an immoral position, one that is opposed to the true God of Christianity. So let's take a look at Hugh's article. It begins with a response to a question of the week. So here's the question of the week. Why do atheists and skeptics spend so much of their time and energy passionately arguing against the existence of God? Now, note that Hugh Ross doesn't question the assumption, but I certainly would. You can flip this around. Let's say somebody asked, why do Christians spend so much of their time and energy passionately arguing for the existence of God? And the first thing I would say is to challenge the very assumption. I don't think it's true that Christians as a group spend much of their time arguing passionately for the existence of God. I think most Christians are not particularly exercised about arguing for the existence of God. They just kind of assume it and accept it and get on with their lives. And I think it's exactly true as well in the opposite direction. Most atheists are not particularly occupied with arguing against the existence of God. Most of them just don't believe God exists and they get on with their life. Really, what this questioner is focusing on is a small subset of the population of atheists and skeptics who are particularly interested in debating the existence of God, which, like Christianity, is just a small subset of the group. So that right away changes the underlying assumption of the question, which is that somehow atheists are really anti-theists. Now, an additional thing to keep in mind here, which should be obvious, but I guess is not, is that one obvious reason why atheists might be particularly interested in debating this topic in a higher proportion relative to their population than you might find in Christianity is that atheists are a minority in the culture, right? They're still maybe 5, 8% of the population uh, in terms of avowed atheists. Certainly non-theists, skeptics, non-religious people, the nuns are N-O-N-E-S, are a far greater percentage of the population, but committed atheists would still be under 10%. But that would mean that there's they're very much in a minority, and that is going to predispose them to a greater awareness of the challenge that their views present to the plausibility structures of so many people around them, which is going to lead naturally to a greater awareness of arguments for and against their beliefs. And that's, again, just a phenomena of being in a minority. It would be the same thing if you were a Christian living in a Muslim country. The likelihood that you're going to be aware of apologetic arguments and evidence for your views over against Islam is going to be much greater than if you're a Christian living in North America. No particular surprise there. Anyway, let's turn to Hugh Ross's answer now. He says, my answer. So he says, you raise here an excellent piece of evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible. And I'm like, what? Okay. He says, in 2008, I did a debate at the International Skeptic Society conference at the California Institute of Technology in front of over 700 atheists. Okay, props to Hugh Ross for doing that. I mean, it's great when Christians are willing to present to overly sort of skeptical and potentially hostile audiences. That's good. And I will say that Hugh Ross, I've met him. I once interviewed him. I find him to be a very affable, friendly fellow. So that's all good. But then he goes on and he says the other 5 atheist scientists who spoke were passionate and intense about the non-existence of the God of the Bible. The gods of the other religions were ignored. Okay, 2 observations here. Of course, they were ignored because the person speaking at the conference on this occasion was a Christian, so they're going to interact with the Christian concept of God. If a Muslim imam hadn't been invited to the conference, then presumably they would have primarily interacted with the Muslim conception of God. So that's the first point. The second point is that once again, keep in mind that we are living in a North American context in which Christianity is the dominant conception of the divine. If this skeptics conference were in Iran rather than in North America, you can assume that the overwhelming focus would be on the Muslim conception of God rather than the Christian one. Nothing to speculate beyond that, I would think. Anyway, he goes on. He says, as I engaged dozens of atheists after the debate, I stated that if they were really convinced the God of the Bible didn't exist, they would treat him like they do the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. Their passion and intensity, I explained, showed that they really do believe in the God of the Bible, but they do not like him. Okay, one thing to keep in mind here is as much as Hugh Ross is a likable person generally, there's a lot of temerity here. There's a lot of gumption. There's a lot of presumption in telling people you really do believe God exists and you're just opposed to God. Hugh Ross is essentially telling them the anti-theist thesis that the fact that you're interested in talking about the Christian God by inviting me here shows that you really do believe the Christian God exists. Not just that you believe God of under some definition exists, but you believe the God, quote, of the Bible exists and you do not like him. Um, that, of course, is a completely, in terms of psychology, there's no justification for making that kind of claim. They're interested in talking about theism and the Christian concept of theism because they invited a Christian theist and because Christian theism is predominant in their culture and because it really influences things like politics. You think how much American politicians appeal to religious and Christian categories to get elected, how views like dispensational theology influences the way the United States interacts with the state of Israel. This makes it enormously important to have an awareness of Christian theology and its impact on the culture. And you can explain that in terms that are just straightforward for these real concerns about the impact of Christianity without invoking and projecting onto the atheist that they really are harboring some latent anti-theistic beliefs. And here's where it gets really interesting because in the final two paragraphs, Hugh Ross's article, I think, turns into a kind of self-own, where he kind of shows these atheists that are skeptical of him really show up his analysis that says that their atheism really is born of anti-theism. So he says their response was telling, quote, it's not that we hate so much the God of the Bible, it's that we despise his followers. They all had stories of how they had been wounded by people who called themselves Christians. I replied that it is ironic and irrational that they allow sinful humans to get between them and a morally perfect God. Okay, so let's just pause there. First of all, this is his synopsis saying we despise his followers. I'm not convinced that Hugh Ross is a charitable narrator of how these atheists express their concerns, that they just says we despise all Christians. I'm skeptical of that. I will recognize that they may well have pointed out that the Christians and the church as an institution have harmed various people in many ways. But Hugh Ross completely misses the point here. He says that's irrational to allow sinful human beings to get between you and a morally perfect God. But they don't believe God exists. Their issue here is that various beliefs about God they believe are fueling harmful and antisocial behaviors in large tracts of people and in religious communities, that they're harming society. And so they're concerned that these religious and theistic beliefs are impacting and harming people. For example, there are many Christians who believe women should not be leaders, that women should be silent, that women are inferior to men because of the way that they read passages in the Bible, like 1 Corinthians 14 or 1 Timothy 2. And this means that this is a concern for people who are really motivated to secure equal rights for women in society. It's not that they hate Christians as such, let alone that they hate the God Christians serve because they don't believe that God exists, but rather they're very concerned about the harm that particular Christian beliefs have upon society. And then it goes on, he goes on, he says, their second response also was telling, quote, if Christians understood how much damage they have caused, maybe they would behave differently. Yeah. See, you can explain, and the irony here is Hugh Ross has explained the concerns that these atheists have without any need to invoke anti-theism as the motivating factor for their skepticism or their interest in and passion about debating Christians on what they believe to be that the non-existence of God. You don't have to attribute anti-theism to them, which is an enormously implausible psychological hypothesis, in order to explain why this subgroup of the atheist and skeptics community is particularly interested in debating the Christian concept of God. It's because they believe it's bringing harmful effects in society. And so they want to debate it and they value truth. And you can have that as a far more credible and charitable explanation for these people rather than attributing to them the anti theism, which is ostensibly the basis for this article itself. And that's why I think, ironically, this article is a self-own, that Hugh Ross here conveys the response of his interlocutors in a way that really undercuts the analysis he is attempting to defend.